What happens in J.B. Priestley's play An Inspector Calls? Let's find out. Hello everyone, my name is Liam, aka Mr. Knight, aka DystopiaJunkie, and this is the first video of my An Inspector Calls GCSE English Literature Revision series. Catchy title, I know. This first video will recap the plot, which will be useful for you if it's been a while since you've studied An Inspector Calls, or even if you're studying it for the first time and you can't make any sense of it. Other videos in this series will cover quotations for key characters, quotations for themes, provide a background to the play, and also go over some key techniques used by J.B. Priestley. If that sounds useful to you, then please do drop this video a like and subscribe to my channel, DystopiaJunkie. I also recommend that you turn on that notification bell too, because that way you definitely won't miss out on any of the other videos in this series when I do release them. So, with all that out of the way, let's summarise the plot of An Inspector Calls. So the play begins with long and specific stage directions, which I will cover in more detail in a later video. It is important to note though that the setting is very much described as a house and not a home. 5 of the main characters are introduced here. At one end of the table is Mr. Birling. Opposite him is his wife, Mrs. Sybil Birling. Sat together on one end of the table are Gerald Croft and Sheila Birling, and opposite them is Eric Birling. As I said, I'll do a video for each of those characters in the future, so do keep an eye out. Now these 5 characters have got together in order to celebrate Gerald and Sheila's engagement. But it's not all totally happy. There are some hints of tension. Mr. Birling relaxes, suggesting that he was feeling on edge before. Sheila teases and jabs at Gerald, half serious, half playfully. And Eric is quite obviously tipsy. Mr. Birling is very happy that Sheila is engaged to Gerald, and not just because his daughter is so happy. Mr. Birling is so happy because by having Sheila marry Gerald, he and his family will advance in a number of ways. Gerald's family are of a higher social class than the Birlings, and so by having Sheila marry into that family, the Birling family's social status and class will also improve. Furthermore, Gerald's family own a company that rivals Mr. Birling's company, and so by bringing the families closer together, Mr. Birling hopes that the businesses can work together rather than against each other. Mr. Birling makes a speech. It is heavy with dramatic irony, but I'll cover that in a bit more detail in a later video. Now Mrs. Birling, Sheila and Eric leave the room. Arthur confides in Gerald and tells him that he thinks he might be receiving a knighthood soon. Eric returns and Birling gives another speech in which he says that a man must look after himself, but just as he finishes saying that, the doorbell goes off. Now that's a significant moment. Edna, the maid, comes in and she says, "Please sir, an inspector's called." But Arthur doesn't worry. Inspector Gould arrives and he tells the men that a girl has died by swallowing a lot of strong disinfectant. He reveals that her name was Eva Smith. The inspector questions Mr. Birling, which Mr. Birling does not like. And the inspector shows Mr. Birling a photograph, and Mr. Birling recognises the person in it as Eva Smith. Mr. Birling says that he fired her 2 years ago, but he does not accept any responsibility for her death. Her dismissal was a long time ago, and he thinks that he was right to sack her because she went on strike and had the cheek to ask for higher wages. Sheila enters the room and Mr. Birling and the inspector tell her about the things that they have just discussed, which distresses Sheila. The inspector explains how Eva Smith eventually found new work at Millward's, which is a fairly nice shop in town. In fact, it is so nice that it is the sort of place that Sheila shops at. Eva, the inspector explains, quickly lost her job. Millward's sacked her, not necessarily through anything that was her fault, but because a customer complained about her. The inspector shows Sheila a photograph, and this distresses her some more. She runs out of the room and Mr. Birling follows her, and this leaves the inspector in the room with Gerald and Eric. Sheila returns and tells the inspector what he already suspected, that she was the customer who got Eva fired. She complained because she was jealous of Eva's looks. She looked beautiful when she held a dress up against herself as if wearing it, whereas Sheila looked awful when she tried that dress on. Sheila thought she saw Eva smiling about this. Sheila feels very bad here. She regrets her actions. The inspector then says that after this, Eva changed her name. She no longer went by Eva Smith, but instead went by Daisy Renton. But upon hearing this, Gerald is visibly shocked. The inspector and Eric then leave, as Eric is taking the inspector to the drawing room, which is where Mr. Birling is. Now that they are alone, Sheila asks Gerald why he looked so shocked when the inspector mentioned the name Daisy Renton. Gerald denies that he ever looked shocked. Sheila asks Gerald lots of questions, and when he doesn't reply to any of them, he inadvertently confirms her theory, that he was in fact involved with Eva/Daisy last summer when he hardly came near Sheila. The inspector arrives, and later at intervals so do Mr. and Mrs. Birling. Gerald begins to tell his story. It starts with him going to the Palace Bar one night. Now Gerald admits that this is a favourite haunt of women of the town, which is a euphemistic way of saying prostitute. When there he saw somebody different to the usual types of women he saw working there. He saw someone who was very pretty. He rescued her from Alderman McGarty, a lecherous old man who also happens to be a senior member of the local council. Gerald lets Eva/Daisy stay at his friend's house. His friend was in Canada and had given him the keys to his house. Eventually, Eva/Daisy became Gerald's mistress. However, as the summer came and went, Gerald's friend's return came closer, and Gerald himself had to go away for business. Their relationship ended. Remembering this and having it dawn on him that Eva/Daisy was dead, Gerald suddenly gets upset. He excuses himself and says that he's going to go for a walk. So Mrs. Birling is the next person to be questioned. We find out that Mrs. Birling works for the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, which is a charity that gives money to women who are in need of it. Eva/Daisy turns up to the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation asking for financial support. However, she makes the fatal mistake of saying that her name is Mrs. Birling. The real Mrs. Birling is shocked and becomes prejudiced against Eva/Daisy's case and therefore rejects it. The inspector announces that Mrs. Birling behaved the way she did, even though she knew that Eva/Daisy was pregnant. Still thinking that she was in the right, Mrs. Birling says that the child is the father's responsibility, that he should have taken care for it, and that he should have to confess to all of this in public. When the inspector asks if she thinks that he should be made an example of, she says yes. Now, whilst all of this is going on, Sheila is slowly connecting all of the dots. A young man who we found out likes to drink a lot, is irresponsible. She knows that this father is Eric. And just as Sheila realises that the father of the child is indeed her brother, he re-enters the room. Eric is questioned and he tells everyone about how he first met Eva/Daisy at the Palace Bar, the same bar that Gerald had met her in months before. Eric, true to character, got drunk. Eric and Eva/Daisy then went to the place that she was staying. He threatened to make a row if she did not let him in. Once in, they slept together. The text makes it unclear about how consensual this was. Eric had to threaten to be violent to be allowed in the first place, but he later also says that they slept with each other again after this night. But then by his own admission, he was also in the state where a chap threatens to turn nasty. Maybe he did turn nasty. Like I said, it's unclear. Eric confesses that whilst he did like Eva/Daisy, he did not love her. And she knew this, which is why she said that she did not want him to marry her.
Which he offered to do because he found out that she was pregnant.
Trying to do something good though, Eric gave her money. Sadly though, this money was stolen. It was stolen directly from Mr. Birling's business. After this, Eric finds out that Mrs. Birling refused to help Eva/Daisy. He shouts at his mum, Sheila tries to stop it, Mr. Birling starts to intervene, and then the inspector takes charge masterfully. They all stop their bickering and listen to him. The inspector makes his final speech, which appears, if you have the same edition as I have, on pages 55 and 56. Now this is a really important speech, as it recaps each character's involvement in Eva's life and ultimate death, brings together a number of key themes, and is an example of Priestley explicitly expressing his socialist message. And once the inspector says this speech, he leaves. The Birlings squabble again, and whilst squabbling, they do make the point that Inspector Gould was quite odd. As they're having this squabble, Gerald returns from his walk and he tells them that he met a police sergeant who had never heard of an Inspector Gould and the local force, nor anyone who sounded anything like him. And they all question whether or not the inspector was even real. So Gerald has an idea. He calls the infirmary and asks if a girl has died by suicide tonight. The infirmary says no. Now the older generation are happy because they're no longer to blame for anything and their reputations will not suffer. On the other hand though, the younger generation are still unhappy because they know that they have done some awful things, even if those awful things didn't exactly kill someone. Now the older generation mock the younger generation, as they, as it says on page 72, can't even take a joke. And then the telephone rings.
Birling answers it. A girl has died in the infirmary.
After swallowing some strong disinfectant.
And an inspector
is on their way to the Birling household.
So, what does happen in J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls? Well, to keep it really, really short, it turns out that an inspector calls. Twice.